Good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation on open access at UA Little Rock. We are thrilled to have you all with us as we explore the growing impact of open access resources and the critical role they play in advancing knowledge and research within our academic community. My name is Michelle Malone, and I am the Library Communications Specialist. This presentation is led by two esteemed colleagues from Ottenheimer Library, J.B. Hill, Library Dean, who will provide insight into the library's strategic efforts to enhance access to scholarly resources and publishing, and Chris Stewart, Discovery and Metadata Coordinator, who will discuss general aspects of open access on campus and a current initiative. We are also grateful to Esma and Tony from the e-learning team, and they are manning the chat and covering the technical aspects of today's event on Zoom. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will answer questions during our discussion time at the end of the presentations. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope this session will inspire further exploration of open access at UA Little Rock. So let's begin. JB?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I guess, and to kind of echo what Michelle said, if you have any kind of questions, put it in your chat and we'll get to it at the end. Also, if you have comments or any ideas that you want to provide to us, I want this to be an opportunity for us to solicit information from you as faculty members to see how we can best support what you're doing and what your needs are. As Michelle said, I'm J.B. Hill, Dean of the Ottenheimer Library. Chris and I are going to be presenting today, but I should give credit to a couple of students who work for us, Clara Acacia and Abolade Salami, who have helped us with the data collection and some of our work and continue to help us with this work. So I want to give them the shout out. They're really great information science students that we're lucky to have with us in the office. But anyway, so I'm going to actually shut off my video so I can make strange faces if I need to. Let's see. So basically, for this presentation, we're going to be talking about open access, and with this, the scope of the presentation is about open access for research materials. We're not going to talk about OER or any kind of educational resources for the classroom. This is strictly how scholarly communication, scholarly output is made available free of charge to users without a subscription, without a paywall. And there are different levels of open access. We're going to be talking mainly about gold and green OA. You'll hear these terms thrown about quite a bit. Platinum, diamond OA is basically the publications are free, available on the internet to anyone who wants to read them, but it's also free to the authors to publish, and that's like the ideal. But of course, more and more is more gold OA, which is what you'll hear, and that's free to the readers. They have access to it, but the authors have to typically fund the publication of that research. And that's either through an open access journal or through a hybrid journal, and a hybrid journal being a journal that's basically a subscription journal that has some articles open because the author has paid to make it open. Bronze OA, which is for publishers when they post things of it, and they used to do it more than they do it now. Repository posting, which is what Chris is going to talk about, for institutional repositories, it's green OA. The other things, gray OA might be something, or black OA. Gray OA may be something you might put something in ResearchGate or a preprint server. Black OA is probably copyright infringement where someone's posted your work and made it available without concern about copyright. But typically what you'll hear is gold OA is the most common thing you'll hear about, and green OA, which is a repository. And that's what we'll talk about. Just as you see, there's been a big change in publication patterns. This looks at the past 10 years, and it's pulled from Scopus. Basically, at the top, the black line, the subscription-based publications has stayed pretty steady, about 1.8 million, gone up to about 1.9 million. But as you see, the gold OA, which is in the gold line, has continued to increase, and it's going to really start increasing in the next few years even more. So you can see that's where the growth has been, whereas it may be 1.9 million publications are subscription based. Almost 1.4 million is open access at the time of publication. So that's a big trend, big changes, change the dynamic of publications. Repository and publisher posting of open access articles, just that's kind of stayed steady, and you see that at the bottom. But most of the activity, obviously, the growth is in scholarly journals who make their materials open, usually based on a fee, author fee. Obviously, the benefits of open access, more exposure to your research. So if you want your ideas to get out there in more, it's very particularly true for developing countries, international audiences who don't have access to subscriptions and can't have access to easily. So the open access definitely improves your reach to the international community. But also, if you're getting grants, obviously that will be a compliance issue that you might be required to do it, but it enables you to make your materials available and comply with the grants, usually federal grants, that to do that. So that's another reason to be open. And then the other piece, which you'll see a lot of literature about higher citation rates, there is some indication that if you make your information available open access, it'll then be available for citation. You'll get further reach. And the numbers are all over the place. You'll see there's been a lot of publications, lots of studies looking at citation rates of open access versus subscription-based product. The numbers vary. So I'm not sure what the actual number will be. I've got one study which I'll point to, which is kind of fairly conservative in the sense of the impact. Sometimes you'll see it 3 times as much citation. Sometimes you'll see even more. But this Springer did a study of their publications over quite a long period of time. And they looked at citations, downloads, and altmetrics that impact. And so what they found is, the downloads really shot through the roof, of course. 6 times, 600% increase of downloads if your publications are open access as opposed to subscription based. Almost five times as many social media, internet, altmetric indicators. That really increases. The citation is up. I think in their citation study was less of an impact, less of an increase, but it still had a 64% increase by being open. So I think there's some evidence that there is obviously an impact. Obviously, you're going to have the materials much more accessible, much more read. The citation levels may or may not increase as much, obviously, because I'll tell you, I've published articles in my lifetime, and some didn't get too many citations. They probably didn't deserve many citations. So, at the end of the day, the quality of the research and the scope of the research will drive the citations probably more than the availability of open access. But it obviously does. Most of the data that they've shown, it is shown that there is a positive impact on your citations if you publish open. Obviously, the other piece that's really the driving the force is the mandates from the government. Some of the government agencies have been, for more than 10 years, has really been pushing, requiring that the data and the publications are made available after a certain period of time. Europe was a little bit ahead of us, but in 2022, there was a memorandum put out by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is really making a big change in the publishing industry, because basically that memorandum is from starting in 2026, any federally funded research must be made, the research outputs must be made without an embargo immediately upon publication or completion of the research. So that's really driving, that's really changing the dynamic for for-profit publishers and scholarly associations, because they've got to figure out how they keep their revenue. They're going to have to make things much more open access going forward. So that's really made a big change in behavior in publishing companies. So as far as the open access process itself, what we're talking about is peer-reviewed research goes through the same process. The researcher does the research, sends the article to the publisher, and the editor assigns reviewers to it. The reviewers review the article and make changes. You have to make changes or not. But once it's accepted, that's the one change that happens. If it's open access, most of the journals most of the for-profit for sure, will require that the author come up with a payment to make it open access. So but then once it's paid for by the author or by the institution, the material becomes freely available to anyone. So that's the one wrinkle. The article processing charges is the one thing. Article processing charge, they can really vary. I think I saw one study was the average is about a little over $1,800 per article. So this is in order to publish open. That's kind of a standard. but I've seen it from a lot of them. Many are still zero, but I think the highest I've seen are $12,000. Nature and Cell, those two journals, particularly if you want to publish open access in those publications, those are high impact publications. They require a hefty article processing charge. And you'll see that article processing charges vary from discipline. Sciences particularly tend to be higher priced article charges. And that's true. The article charges could be for pure open journals like the MDPIs or the PLOS or Frontier, those open access publishers, or they may be your Elsevier's or Springer's, where they're subscription based, they're hybrid journals, and the author pays to make their materials open for that particular journal. So it's kind of both cases. The article processing charge can vary from title to title, publisher to publisher. With that said, obviously journals and producers, they realize that authors, quite frankly, don't have the funds to pay for open access. So if publishers are going to need to find ways to continue to increase revenue, keep revenue coming in. So if the authors cannot pay, perhaps the university and libraries will pay. So that came about. I think Chris and I met with. First time I ever heard about it was probably 5 years ago. Chris and I met with Cambridge folks, and they were pitching this idea, and I thought, well, this is really an unusual idea. It's the first time I thought about libraries actually entering in agreements which would support author publication, but that's becoming more and more common. They're sometimes called transformative agreements, but this is for hybrid journals, particularly that say that you're Elsevier or Springer, you make a deal with the publisher, the university does, and in addition to having a subscription, we also have the rights for our authors to publish free or at a discount in their publications. So that enables us to support, the libraries to support open access publication using kind of leveraging subscription dollars to fund these agreements. Right now, we started looking into it. We started our first process of open access read and publish agreements in January of 2024. So we've got 3 agreements in place now. So the question we've had, and this is kind of what kind of prompted this, some of the information that we're going to present today, is we've got to figure out where are authors publishing, where do they want to publish? If we're going to sign an agreement, where do we need to go with that agreement? Which publishers should we sign agreements with? So that's kind of the emphasis of doing a little bit of research that we've been doing. Basically, what we've done in library is we looked at a study of articles published since 2020, and we pulled out 674 articles. This is by going through Google Scholar, Web of Science, the EBSCO databases, the ProQuest databases, any place that we had access into indexing information for UA Little Rock authors, and we pulled those citations into a database and created one of just a certain number of articles that were published, and so that we could look at and see how many were open, where were they published, and get a little more information. Then more recently, we did that in spring and summer. More recently, I just sent out a survey to faculty to try to get a little bit of more qualitative data about how did they fund open and who should fund it. So we sent a survey to the 200 faculty members that we pulled out of those 674 articles and sent the link to the survey to get their responses. And we got 60, which is not a huge number, but it does give us some information. But looking at our study, looking at those 600, almost 700 articles by our faculty, these are the primary publishers, the top ones. Obviously, they published in many journals, but the top publishers tended to be the 5 big for-profit publishers: Taylor & Francis, which is typically a social sciences publisher; Springer and Elsevier and Wiley, which are science and social sciences; Sage tends to be social sciences. Those big publishing, that's where our faculty have been publishing the most. MDPI and Frontiers, those are 2 open access publishers. All their content is open, and they require the APCs. And we've had some people, actually faculty members, publishing there. And of course, professional societies and university presses, that's another source of where our faculty have been publishing. So we kind of just got a snapshot. We're trying to figure out. So we're looking at this. I would say that Taylor, Francis, Springer, Elsevier, Wiley, those are good sources for us to sign agreements for read and publish just by looking at this. That would be an indicator that we'll get more bang for our buck if we support more faculty members with those publishers. Then we started looking at the open access publishing. And I was actually very surprised with the data that we found. Typically industry-wide, as we saw a little bit while ago, about 40% of publications now are published open access. But I looked at those 674 articles, and we looked at, were they open as of summer 2024? So it might be, was it published initially open access? Has it become available open access due to after an embargo period? We don't know how it got to be open, but by going to the gold open access, going to the publisher website and seeing if we could get access with no authentication, and we found that basically 42% of the articles in our study were actually available for free on the internet. So one of the things I thought about, well, maybe it's because we've been kind of piggybacking with the authors who maybe have university has funded or has grant funding. So I thought, well, maybe we were co-authoring, and maybe the lead author and was somebody at another university. Because typically speaking, the lead author, corresponding author, is the author who is responsible for the article processing charge. So that's how it is assigned. But anyway, we found that still the same. It was about 40%. When our faculty were lead authors, was still available currently open access of that 674 articles. Once again, we don't know how they got to be open, but they are. So then we start looking at breaking down the open access, drill down a little bit deeper into data. Out of those articles, as a percentage, DC STEM generated the most of the open access articles. About 50% were actually coming from faculty members there. The other open access were kind of split between humanities, the Chase, and then the College of Business, HHS. So that was about 25%. If you look at it by college, if you look at the researchers in the College of Business, Health, and Human Services, for example, 28% of their articles published out of that set were open access. For Chase, it was 26.5%, but basically, as you see, DC STEM had much higher levels of open access. At 52% of their articles were open access. So you can see, and that's not a surprise, because obviously in the sciences and the STEM areas, you had the whole open access movement started out of the STEM areas, particularly the preprint servers, early 90s even. So, and there's also possibly a grant funding that may be available to those researchers that are not available for our people in the social sciences and humanities. So that's showing where our open access publications are mainly coming from. And as far as we tend to, our people are publishing with the large publishers, so the open access by category, by the publisher and society. I was looking at that a little bit, trying to think about how was that happening. So it tends to be we're publishing open access of different for-profits, open publishers, and society publishers. So you can see those percentages. So then I looked at, well, okay, we looked at the titles. Previously, I showed the publishers that were the most heavily published in. And so if we break those down a little further and look at open access versus non-open access out of that set of 674 articles, Taylor & Francis, as you can see, has very low open access. And I'd say out of these publishing groups, Taylor & Francis tends to be the most conservative with open access. They typically charge high fees. Taylor & Francis tends to be in the social sciences, maybe humanities to a lesser degree. So there may not be as much funding, but they haven't really promoted open access agreements as much. So anyway, so long story short, Taylor & Francis, our authors who are publishing with Taylor & Francis tend to be publishing subscription-based only, not open access. Springer, Elsevier, Wiley, and Sage, they're all doing about close to 35 to 40%, which is kind of what our standard is. Of course, MDPI and Frontiers, if you're going to publish there, that's all going to be open. The American Chemical Society was kind of an outlier. I might want to go back and look at that data again to see if we make sure we counted that properly, but they showed a very high percentage of open access publications. Whereas somebody like Oxford University Press, which is a primarily humanities publisher, there was zero open access published with them, and Royal Society of Chemistry, there was 0% actually made available through open access with them as well. So it's kind of just an interesting mix of open access versus non-open access with the places that our faculty are publishing. So in addition, that kind of gives a snapshot of what we found with the publishing. So then I followed up and said, well, okay, we'll send a survey, see if we find out some, because what I was trying to figure out, and my personal, I'll go back a little bit, my personal view was, my assumption was there's been a lot of funding opportunities. There has not been a lot of funding opportunities for faculty publishing, other than grant-based funding. So I kind of thought, well, I was really surprised by the number of open access publications that we're generating, and particularly with for-profits, which you're going to have to pay those fees. So I was kind of surprised. So I kind of dig a little bit deeper. We went out and did a survey. Don't have a lot of responses, so I don't think I would bet any money on these feedback I got. But I just do say that of the 60 people who responded, they were kind of evenly split between the different colleges. And one of the things I did ask, we asked about, well, what is your opinion of open access? So you kind of think publishing my research open is my preference, and basically 70% kind of agreed that was their preference. And I asked the question, was it favorably viewed within their department? There was some less surety whether that was the case, but there tended to be generally positive view that it was be well thought of in their department, but there was obviously some faculty members who weren't quite sure. One thing I was trying to ask, well, who should be paying for this? And I guess majority, 72% kind of said they agreed that the funding should be the university's responsibility. I then asked, well, within the university, it should be the library. Not so, they weren't so sure about that. And I'm not so sure either. But so that's kind of interesting. But then also, should it be up to the author to either pay or find funding sources themselves? And kind of the flip side of the university, where the university is assumed to be should be paying for it. 70% of the faculty said who responded said no, they really shouldn't be the author's burden. It should be the university's burden. The one thing I said, although they weren't quite sure whether open access funding should be the library's responsibility, there was positive view that read and publish agreements where authors' publishing fees could be covered as part of subscriptions was generally viewed as favorable. So that's kind of general. I asked about, when kind of digging around about the impact of funding, trying to see, has your research been influenced by where you published? Was that determined by whether you had research funding? Most faculty responded said no, but about a third did say that did impact them, that if they couldn't go open access because they didn't have the funds. They had to be very selective when they did to find places where they could publish free or very low cost. They didn't have the resources to do that. So about a third of the people did say it did influence them. And the other little piece I kind of thought about, since the corresponding author was responsible for the funding, did that affect whether our researchers had to step back and let another more well-funded researcher from a colleague from another university be the corresponding or lead author? And that really didn't, I thought that might be the case, but the numbers really didn't show that. It's a very small percentage there that it really affected that. So then we did ask, have you published open access since January 2022? About half have, about 50-50. And then it said why. And the main purpose, there was a little bit of just a very small number of respondents who talked about grant funding. Most of it was personal preference, or the journal itself. They had identified the journal they wanted to publish in. It made sense for the research. It had the reach that they wanted to. And so they were choosing the journal, and it happened to be open. So then I was trying to look at article processing charges. Interestingly, half of the people who've published in this survey said that they had no charge. And there are many, there are thousands of journals out there that are scholarly journals, open access, that do not charge charges. So that actually, that seems like a lot of our faculty are using those avenues. When they are paying APCs, it tends to be under $2,000, but there have been some in the $2,000s to $3,000 range that they've had to pay APCs. So just kind of get a sense of what the expectations are from publishers for our faculty. Then I kind of thought, well, okay, how are you funding it? And of course, large percentage haven't actually paid. Some have used grant funding. I think that's been the big driver. In some cases, other authors, 18.5%, that other authors from other universities that had funding, either through grant or through institutional support. So that tended to be the two biggest places, a little bit of university and departmental funding, sometimes in personal funds, but it's kind of a mixed bag on that. So then one last question we did ask was, say, if the library is going to help out by making subscriptions with publishers that will help not only give us subscription access, but publishing rights, publishing access for free for authors, who should we look for? And that's kind of one of the things and if anyone in this session has suggestions as well that they didn't respond here, I'd love to see that in the chat, because we're trying to figure out who are the publishers that are most important for our faculty to publish in. And so Elsevier, obviously, in the American Chemical Society, we had four people suggested that. MDPI and Frontiers, which are open access. Those and Taylor Francis, Royal Society of Chemistry, Sage, Wiley, and then single digits for the other ones, single entries for the others. So it's a mixed bag of possibilities. So what we're doing now, I will say what we've done and what we're going to do in the short run. Right now, we've got 3 agreements in place. The Association of Computing Machinery, we've had that. They're a professional society in computer science, and they're open access, and they're pretty easy to process open access charges through. So we get free publication there. Cambridge University Press, which is primarily humanities journals. Then we've got the Springer package, which is our biggest package, and they have various subcategories. They don't include Nature itself. That's your $12,000 one. But the Springer Nature package does include 2,100 journals. So that's in 2024. Those are the ones we've been having in place this year. For next year, we are negotiating right now with Science Direct's Elsevier. I expect that we will have an agreement in January that we're working with the University of Arkansas System libraries to come up with a deal that will allow us to subscribe to all the content, but also publish for free. American Chemical Society, I've got a quote from them that looked pretty good. So we're dealing with them directly. What I would say about the for-profits, sometimes we have to make deals with consortium collaborations with other universities in order to get a good deal. The societies tend to be easier to work with and more reasonable about what they expect. I wouldn't say American Chemical Society is reasonable about the prices, but that said, the open access, they are more supportive of open access with less cost than, say, some of the for-profits. Wiley is a possibility. I don't know if that's going to happen in this this academic or this calendar year coming up, but there's been some discussion about that. So those are the ones that I think are really likely. Some of the others that were mentioned, like something Taylor and Francis, they're not playing very much in the open access space. They are signing some agreements, but they don't seem to be too proactive in that area at this point. Royal Society of Chemistry, which another one was mentioned, that would be one. It'd be really expensive for us to get into that one, but that is available as an option. Frontiers and MDPI, the open access publishers, instead of having read and publish agreements, what they tend to have is either discount programs or deposit programs where the university can put a certain amount of money into deposit, and then our faculty can draw from it. So since it's not a subscription-based product, they will take deposits, and that's how they handle it. So I think Wiley is probably, like I say, will probably happen. Sage is another one that was mentioned. That one, I think that one's on tap for maybe 2026. We might be able to get into a deal like that, but I don't think we'll get it for 2025. But that's to be determined. So that's kind of what we're working on right now. We're trying to, whenever possible, any kind of agreements that are coming up for renewal, we are looking at the opportunities to do that. We recently signed with the University of Arkansas an agreement with IEEE. So that's in a 3-year deal. I don't know if we'll be able to get a read and publish agreement with IEEE in the near term, but that could be renegotiated. But I don't know if that's going to happen. But anyway, so right now we do have 2 for sure that I think will happen before for next year. But once that happens, once we have a read and publish agreement in place, you as an author will go through your usual process of submitting, getting approval. Then if it is a Springer, a Cambridge, an ACM, and perhaps next year a Elsevier or a ACS publication, when your article is accepted, you'll receive an email or whatever information from the publisher, and you will just typically have to identify yourself as affiliated with UA Little Rock. And usually we've got it set up so it goes pretty smooth, and you can just do it with your email. As long as you're using a ualr.edu email, you should be able to take advantage of the discounted rate, or in this case, free rate. Then, of course, once you'll select open access, and you'll have to sign your typical license agreement that you do in this case Creative Commons, but and then it go be published. We have set it up our agreements as much as possible to be streamlined so that we don't actually have to touch them in the library. That it actually goes, and as long as you're a ualr.edu affiliated, it'll pass on through without us having to verify it. But some publishers, Springer and Elsevier, do require us to kind of click a button and say, yeah, it's okay, yay or no. But our process will be to try to streamline that as much as possible. So that's kind of the workflow that's envisioned for the read and publish agreements, and the ones that are in place and the ones that we'll have in the future. And I would say when you get ready to publish, we do have a list of titles from our on our website that you can look at which ones are available. If you encounter problems or anything, you can always just communicate with us, and we can try to troubleshoot and see if in fact you should have free access to open access publishing, and when they're not giving it to you. So we can play that role for you. So I should note we have a deal for Springer. And I'll just point this out. We actually signed a deal with Springer through a consortium of lyricists with maybe a dozen or so other Southeastern libraries. And they kind of reported this back at a meeting not too long ago. And I don't know what the impact on our publications, but just looking at the 700 articles that Springer has published from these 12 or so universities, if you look at the impact, what they were showing, kind of interesting enough, is the red line, or orange, I'm not sure what color that is, that shows recognized usage. It means it's coming through a Springer subscriber institution. The blue is basically it's coming from anywhere else. So I guess it was just they were just showing that by making your publications open access, in this case, the ones we made with our Springer deal, you've got basically 3 times as many downloads as you would have gotten. You get 3 times as many downloads from non-subscribers as you do from subscribing institutions. So, but anyway, that's just kind of just a little interesting little thing. So that shows the impact that making something open will provide for you as a researcher. In addition, I would say the read and publish agreements are typically for hybrid journals that are subscription based, and that there's an article processing charge and they get waived. Typically speaking, for the open access publications that maybe Springer has open access publications, Elsevier does. Those read and publish agreements don't cover the pure open access titles. Those the way we support the open access titles that are not covered by read and publish agreements, we do have a fund. We set up, I think the provost asked Brian Berry, Sarah Beth Estes, and myself to set up, kind of come up with a plan for a publishing support fund to try it out. And so right now we're funding up to $2,000 per article for open access journals, not hybrid journals, but if you're going to a journal that is purely open, like an MDPI or Frontier, or maybe a Springer that's a pure open Springer journal that's not covered by our agreement, we would support that with basically up to $2,000. And these are for peer-reviewed scholarly publications. We at the library, when we get requests, and there's a link to the form, I think it might be in the chat, that if you put in a request for that, we verify that the journal is one of that's peer-reviewed and scholarly, but we don't get into the business. Obviously, your publication has already been peer-reviewed and accepted by the publishing, and we leave it up to the faculty to determine this is a good venue for your research. We do look for it. We just basically check to see, in some cases, and we actually found one case that perhaps it's a predatory journal and not a journal that we want to support. So if that's the case, we'd have a conversation and see if that's really what the faculty member wants to publish in. But basically, but it's pretty straightforward. We haven't had as many takers as we'd like. So obviously, I just want you to be aware that if you're publishing in an open access publication and don't have funding, that this is an avenue to get more money for your research. Okay, so at this point, I'm take a breath here, and I talked too good a little bit, but I wanted to give Chris Stewart, my colleague here at Ottenheimer, and he's going to talk about our institutional repository, which will be basically talking about how we might support faculty with through green open access. And I'll turn it over to you, Chris. And you can tell me, I'll be Vanna, you can tell me when to change the slide.
Very good. I don't have snappy graphics, so I've started my video so that my face can entertain you. Before I go into institutional repositories, if you're like me, you might be new to scholarly publishing, and all of this may seem strange. What's being talked about here? And so I just wanted, for those newcomers like myself, I wanted to give a really quick overview of what JB just talked about. So the traditional publication path is that my colleague and I write a research paper, and we want to submit it to a scholarly journal. So we do that, and there's 3 different paths that publication can take. The traditional one is the journal says, we love your article, we want to publish it, thanks. And it goes into the journal, which is often an online subscription-based journal. So it's behind what we call a paywall. You have to have a subscription. And in fact, this library, Ottenheimer, doesn't subscribe to all the journals that UALR researchers publish in. I just mentioned that we have to be selective about our subscriptions. So the second path is the journal says, we love your article, we can publish it behind our paywall, or you have the opportunity to use open access. And we go, open access, that sounds great. We want to do that. And the publisher says, oh, well, we should mention that there's a $3,000 article publishing charge for open access. And that means that my colleague and I have to find $3,000 if we want this article to be open access. And JB talked about the support that the library does. We can support $2,000, and sometimes that will cover the APC, article processing charge. Sometimes it won't. The third path is the journal says, we love your article, and guess what? Your library has an agreement with us that researchers from your organization can publish freely and with open access in this journal. That's what's called the Read and Publish Agreement. It's also called the Transformative Agreement, which is to me, I still can't get over that it's called transformative. It's very helpful though, really helpful language. So, like I said, the library doesn't subscribe to every journal that UALR researchers publish in. So how can we get open access to the research that's happening on campus? And one way will be by an institutional repository. This is basically a database that will archive and make available the research that happens, the scholarly output of our campus. It provides visibility, so it's also a promotional tool. One of the things I wanted to say that there's interest in many fields on reproducibility of results. And so we'll also be hosting data sets on which articles are based. The open access, from our point of view, it's a rights retention instrument. It gives the author control of how they distribute their articles. I'm sorry, I looked at a chat. Never look at the chat. And to put a published paper into an institutional repository sometimes requires permissions from publishers. How does this work? And from a librarian point of view, institutional repositories are really helpful. For instance, we'll get a request for an interlibrary loan request. We can't find it anywhere. And so I'll go look to see what institution are the authors associated with. And often I can find the article for free, freely accessible in an institutional repository at the affiliated institution. One other thing I wanted to say is there was a quick mention of predatory journals. And because I'm trying to get everyone up on the same page of what is open access, predatory journals are these fly-by-night, often fly-by-night opportunists that come in and say, hey, I have an academic journal and I'll publish your article open access. You just got to pay me $500. And often these fly-by-night predatory journals bypass peer review. They're kind of a, in the worst case, they're a make money quickly off from unsuspecting authors type of organization. Okay, next slide. Before I go into these policies, I also wanted to say that as a promotional tool for the university, the institutional repository will also allow us to have researcher profiles for all our scholarly authors on campus. And this is where we can show the entire writing history of our researchers. Those can often be harvested if the pieces aren't in the institutional repository, we can at least harvest links out to show where those articles are available. And so one of the things we might start doing is promoting the use of ORCID registration for all our researchers. So how do I find out what a journal's open access policy is? Is it going to cost me money to publish in open access in this journal? How much money? If I want to put something into my institutional repository after it's published, am I allowed to do that? If I want to put a preprint version before it gets published, put the preprint into the institutional repository, can I do that? Well, there's a website. It's hosted by, I wrote it down here, the Joint Information System Committee. It's a nonprofit organization. They put together a website called Sherpa. Romeo is the tool. They aggregate and analyze the publisher open access policies. I've looked up on Sherpa Romeo, and thanks for sharing that link to Sherpa Romeo, the Journal of Language and Aging resource. And under publisher policy, I can see that it gives me three paths. One is for the published version, one is for the accepted version, prior to accepted, not yet published, and one is for the submitted version. This would be the preprint version. And there are these icons. If you go to the next slide, please. So let's look at what these icons mean under the published version. If you open up one of these paths, it explains what these icons mean. This tells us about open access publishing, that yes, the Journal of Language and Aging Research out of Hamburg University Press allows open access publishing. There's no embargo. It uses a Creative Commons license. The author is the copyright owner, And it can be published on any website or any journal website. That means that it includes the author's homepage, the institutional repository. It's very important when using Sherpa Romeo to look at the conditions under which open access are allowed. And this says the published source, that is the Journal of Language and Aging Research, should be acknowledged with a citation, and you must link to that version with a DOI. Next slide, please. This same article could be put into an institutional repository as a preprint. That is, before it's been published, even before it's been submitted. As long as you're submitting it to Journal of Language and Aging Research, there'll be no embargo. It could go into any repository, including the author's homepage, institutional repository, and the same conditions will hold, that you must link with a DOI, give a citation. So next slide, we'll look at one from Taylor and Francis, brain-computer interfaces. On the Taylor and Francis site, it's advertised as an open access journal. What does that mean? Well, I went to Sherpa Romeo and looked this up. And that pound sign, it's British, and that's why they use the Sherpa Romeo is coming out of Britain. That's why they use the pound sign. This has an open access fee associated with it. And I'll tell you, I tried to publish a paper in a Taylor Francis journal. The open access fee was $3,000. So if I wanted it to be open access, I would have to come up with $3,000. The published version, that is, it got published and I want to put it into my institutional repository, that is allowed by this journal with no embargo, Creative Commons license. This is also for this journal, it's also going to go into PubMed Central. It can go into any website, which includes the institutional repository, and the published source must be acknowledged. So even though this journal is advertised as an open access journal, I will no longer be so naive as to think that it doesn't require a fee. Someone has to pay for the publication of that article, the article publication charge, APC. Next slide. So we talk about preprints, and the preprints have become really popular in the fields of chemistry, material sciences, have been notable for their use of preprints. I want to say that there are dedicated subject preprint servers. The most famous is probably Archive, that's ARXIV. They're a preprint server for physics, math, and computer science. This is where if you want to get your information out quickly, you can often use one of these preprint servers. Alternatively, you can also publish in your own institutional repository. It offers a platform for researchers to share their work prior to formal review. Publishing preprint is not a substitute for peer-reviewed publications, but and if it's a preprint, it's made obvious on the version that it is a preprint. We saw that preprints became very important during the COVID time, when the vaccine information had to be exchanged very quickly, accelerated the overall research process. Next slide. There's also this thing you might come upon the phrase gray literature, and don't be scared. Gray literature is actually good stuff. It includes theses and dissertations. which for UALR, those are currently behind a ProQuest paywall. You have access to them, but people outside of UALR do not. So by hosting the theses and dissertations, that will be the first collection that we include in the institutional repository. It'll serve as a demonstration of the institutional repository, and it will allow open access to the theses and dissertations. We'll also be able to host the posters, the research posters that come out of the Research and Creative Works Expo. It's likely that the UALR administration will want to use the institutional repository to host policy documents to enhance the transparency of our organizational policies. If we have high-profile speakers on campus, we can record those and make those available on the institutional repository. Go ahead, next slide, please. I'm going to answer a question that just came in. I realized we were going to save questions, but I'm going to say, yes, there's an institutional repository task force that's at work right now choosing institutional repository platforms. One of our requirements will be that the institutional repository platform can do what's called DOI mining, I think is what it's called, where a DOI number is a unique number that identifies a digital object, usually an article, but a DOI can also go for other types of documents, including videos and stuff like that. We want our institutional repository to be user-directed. We want it to be a service that the library provides to the campus. It'll be a place where open educational resources can be hosted. The advantage of this is that the library will take over the curation and the maintenance of your open educational resources, if that's advantageous to you. One of the advantages also is that using the institutional repository platform, it takes care of the thorny problem of OER versioning, which a lot of OER authors find difficult when they have to make subtle changes into different versions of an OER object. And of course, the institutional repository will provide equitable access to course materials to all the students. Next slide. The institutional repository task force is going to distribute a survey, and we're going to conduct a focus group to see what do people on campus want from an institutional repository. The first thing we'll be asking is, do you know what an institutional repository can do for you? And the second question will be, if you do know this, what do you want it to do for you? That survey should be coming out. We may try to get it out before the end of this semester. It may be advantageous to wait until next semester to promote that survey. But please, if you see this survey come through and you have insight into how you might use an institutional repository, please take the survey. We'll be we'll thank you very, we'll give you a lot of things. Next slide, please. So as a researcher or as a student, how can I use open access? I have a screen capture from the library catalog, and I've looked up language and aging research. And as you can see, there's over 16,000 results have come back. And I want to use open access. There may be a lot of reasons why I want to use open access, It may be that I want to share it freely. I don't want to be concerned with copyright constraints. There are constraints with open access. They're usually covered in Creative Commons license, but open access will allow me to distribute and share the information a lot more freely. So I can filter all my 16,000 results just by picking open access availability over on the filters on the left-hand side of my screen. Then I'll be able to see that all my results have this very attractive open access icon. And that's how I'll know that these are open access. So this is how you would find open access material. If I'm an instructor, maybe I want to use open access so that I can distribute the material without some strict copyright constraints. So I may be interested in adopting open access material in my instruction. Next slide. And I'll let JB talk about for more information.
Okay, I think that finishes what we're going to say. Basically, I think the links were put in the chat so that as we've kind of been talking about things that the library can try to support you, try to help you where we can. We're looking at the read and publish agreements. Hopefully we'll have some more of those coming forward. The Open Access Publishing Support Fund, I think those links were put in the chat, but if you go to our library services or faculty page, that'll link you to it and encourage you to submit. We haven't had as many open access publishing support fund requests that we thought we might have, because there's a lot of open access publishing happening as we've seen today. So we want to make sure that researchers are aware that this is an option for them and to help them. And I think that's one of the things we're trying. And then with the institutional repository, that's something we hope to launch, maybe this summer, that this coming summer, that we can have another way that we can support, particularly looking at, as Chris mentioned, some of the non-published material that the universities creates. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to questions or comments. I saw in the comments, I think some other suggestions for read and publish agreements, MDPI, PLOS, and Frontiers. Those those we're looking at. There's probably most of those publishers sometimes will give free access to article processing charges. Sometimes they'll just be discounts. But based on the data that we've seen today, it looks like there's a demand for those. So those are good uses of money to be able to support that. So does anybody at this point have questions that you can feel to chime in? And let me see if I can stop sharing here for a minute and open it up to any questions you have, any comments, suggestions. We're definitely open. That's what we're here for, to find out more that can help us help you better. Any questions? They can put it in the chat or comment out loud. You can just don't have to raise your hand.
See a chat question about, will institutional repository material have DOIs?
I didn't hear that.
Will institutional repository material have DOIs? This is from Bob.
Oh, yes. The institutional repository platform will automatically assign DOIs to the material that we make available.
So Chris, I had a question about institutional repository. You talked about preprint versions. So for example, if I've submitted an article to a journal and it's under review, do I have to send a version to you for depositing it in the institutional repository?
That's a good question. And one of the ways I don't have an answer, and because it can be done in two ways. One is that we can just ask authors if they want to do, you can either self-deposit your own articles, you can ask the library to deposit it. And then the third way would be that we automate and we harvest your articles automatically from the publisher and put it into the institutional repository automatically, so that neither you would have to, it would be automatically uploaded without you having to deposit it to the institutional repository. I bet that that all three options will be used. Some people won't be comfortable with self-depositing, but I think that self-depositing, you having a researcher profile page that you control yourself, I think is the best option.
Yeah, and you're right what you said, not being comfortable, because I mean, I have never done this, but also the journal or the publisher may have some reservations or something as well. I don't know. Yeah.
That's correct. And that will be one of the responsibilities of the library to research the permissions of the journal to see if you are allowed to put a open access copy into an institutional repository. We'll be doing that for you in the library, looking up those permissions.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
And I should say, as far as the institutional repository, the task force is charged to come up with, to decide which platform we're going to use. And one of the things that it is, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, the task force is looking at is integration with faculty success, so that perhaps that tool could be, since faculty members, part of the annual review process and your reporting process, you're inputting data about your publications into faculty success. And so that would be a great opportunity to be able to pull that and make some of that information available into the repository. Because since faculty success is not outwardly facing, but the institutional repository will be outwardly facing and would allow the creation of our author profiles, researcher profiles that could do that.
One of the big obstacles for institutional repositories is getting campus buy-in. Some people may say, I've already published it in an article, published it in a journal. Why should I do extra work to put it into the institutional repository? And so it'll be up to the library to show the advantages of open access to authors. And then it may, with authors' permissions and with the university permission, we'll be able to use what's called an API to harvest the article metadata from faculty success to overcome that obstacle of having to do more work. So we'll try to do as much work for you as possible and automate your publishing history so that you don't have to start, keep it up yourself, except in one place.
Okay, any other questions today? Okay, Michelle, you're going to take us out?
I'll go ahead and close us out. So thank you all for attending today's presentation on open access at UA Little Rock. And we hope that this session has given you a deeper understanding of the benefits and possibilities open access provides for enhancing research, learning, and knowledge sharing at our university. Additionally, a big thanks to Esma and Tony and the fantastic eLearning team for hosting this event and for assisting with the links in the chat. And of course, thanks to our presenters, JB Hill and Chris Stewart. We appreciate everybody's engagement and we encourage you to continue the conversation and explore how open access can enhance your own work. If you have any lingering questions, or if you'd like to follow up on today's topics, please don't hesitate to reach out. JB and Chris's email addresses are in the chat. We're excited about the possibilities ahead and look forward to seeing how open access will continue to evolve at UA Little Rock. So thanks again so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.